When you think about anime, what's the very first thing that pops into your mind? Epic power-ups, crazy fights, insane stories that span over the course of 25 years? It's cat girls. Let's be honest, it's cat girls. When you think of anime, one of the first things most people think of, especially newer anime fans, is animation. Having good animation is what can set your show apart from being another forgettable seasonal anime to making its permanent mark on the anime world. A show like Soul Eater wouldn't get nearly as much love as it does if it didn't have the insane action. And I think this is especially evident in the Western market because for a long time, Western animation, specifically American animation, has been pretty stagnant. Because companies in the West, America especially, love to just kind of do what works when it comes to animation, many fans are drawn to anime because of all the unique styles and ways that they animate their shows. It feels like we're in an anime renaissance. It feels like in recent years, every single season, we just get random bangers that nobody has heard of. This summer 2024 season, we have the Elusive Samurai and Wistoria Wand and Sword, which no one had really heard of the manga, and now they're the biggest and hypest shows of this season in a season that has Fairy Tail 100 Years Quest and Oshinoko airing. Oh, but Davis, animation isn't the only thing that matters. These stories are getting so basic, I just can't enjoy them. And as much as I would like to completely disagree about people whining about plots, I honestly kind of agree. Even though it seems like we're getting more insane animation, the plots do seemingly get more and more basic. And because of that, a big conversation among anime fans nowadays is whether or not animation truly matters, and that's what brings me to this video. I decided to dive into animation so I can give the definitive answer to this question. Does animation matter? I'm just joking. This is an extremely subjective topic, so everybody's gonna feel different about this. I'm just gonna go through some different shows and talk about how the animation either helped them, hurt them, or just kind of didn't do much for them. My bad, guys. I got a little carried away with that intro, but hey, if you liked it, hit subscribe. Alright, right off the start, I will give you my opinion. Yes, animation matters. Of course it does. But just how much does it matter? Listen, you guys knew it was coming when the video was about animation. The most well-known example of a good anime with bad animation is Seven Deadly Sins. When this show first came out, it was enormous. It was animated by A1 Pictures, and although it didn't have the greatest animation, it was pretty good. This show was pretty inescapable. Seven Deadly Sins profile pictures in the comments, Escanor references everywhere. It was huge. That was until season 3. When it came out and had some of the worst animation in all of anime.
Look at this dude.
And I'm not gonna lie, as somebody who's never watched it, it kind of made me want to watch it just so I could laugh at how bad it was. And since then, you never hear about Seven Deadly Sins online anymore unless it's in a negative connotation. You used to be unable to escape this show, but once this season came out, no one was ever able to take it seriously, and this show has now been memed into oblivion, and even though the animation has semi-recovered, not a lot of people watch it, and the ones that do don't really talk about it. And there's our first point. Really bad animation can ruin a series, cut and dry. Another great example of this is The Flowers of Evil, also known as Aku no Hana, a show that when it first came out was completely dogpiled on because people hated the animation style. You see, the way this show was animated was by rotoscoping, and if you don't know what that is, it's when the animators draw over a video of a real-life person moving, and it gives off this really uncanny movement effect that a lot of people just find really ugly. Now, there are some good examples of this, like in Vinland Saga. A lot of those fights are rotoscoped and you don't notice it, but when done to the entire show, it's completely noticeable and a lot of people don't like it. When it first came out, it got terrible reviews, and the biggest part about that was the animation. People just couldn't look past it. Even though they were trying to do something unique and new, only now, years later, the rating of the anime is starting to be a little more accurate. So I'll state it again. If you don't have an animation style that people like, they're not going to take your show seriously and in turn be a lot more critical. Now let's focus on the flip side of this. Anime that maybe doesn't have the strongest story, but they put so much care into the animation that it carries it into legendary status. Now I might get a little bit of hate for this, but in my opinion, the best example of this is Jujutsu Kaisen. Jujutsu Kaisen is probably the biggest anime in the world, riding off of the success of the second season. But I wouldn't say this show does anything particularly special when it comes to battle shonen besides the great power system. It's like a combination of Naruto and Bleach. I wouldn't say the main cast, aside from Gojo, really stand out all that much. But what's so great about Jujutsu Kaisen is the fact that it's just turn your brain off fun. It doesn't try to be anything more than it is, and it's just a lot of fun and hype fights. But what really makes it stand out is just the absolutely gorgeous animation. This show arguably has the best animation of all time. In other shows like One Piece or My Hero Academia that are just full of action all the time, naturally not every fight is going to be top tier. And that's something anime fans have come to accept. Most of the budget will go to the big climactic fights where the hero fights the villain, not where the female love interest fights the smaller and less climactic villain. And that's where Jujutsu Kaisen completely kills it. Every single fight without fail in the show is just top tier. Even the worst fights in the entire series would be top tier fights in any other show. And because of that, it has become not only the biggest anime in the world, but also the biggest manga in the world, surpassing One Piece in sales for the first time in years. Another great example of this is actually from this season. It's called Wistoria, Wand and Sword. This show is just an unapologetic mix of big shonen from the past years. The plot is basically in a world where magic reigns supreme and the people who use that magic reign at the top of society. Our main character, Will, doesn't have any magic. But to compensate for this, he has superhuman strength that far surpasses that of any mage, and in order to harness his skills, he needs to roam a dungeon. Now, this is just a basic anime plot that would be forgotten in any other season. But because the animation is so insane, this is one of the most hyped up anime of the entire summer 2024 season, which brings me to the second point. If you have a pretty basic plot and just deliver on good action and beautiful animation, people will watch your show. That's it for that section. I just wanted to talk about some of the outliers, shows with bad animation, so bad that it's unwatchable, and pretty basic shows with beautiful animation that get an insane amount of hype. But now I want to move on to art style and talk about whether or not art style or animation are more important, even though they oftentimes go hand in hand. When people think of animation, a lot of the time they think of the fights, the crazy choreography of Naruto fights, the insane animation in the Attack on Titan ODM scenes, all of Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2. But I think something that's even more important is the art style, which normally depends a lot more on the manga than the anime. A show like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure doesn't necessarily have the most fluid and well choreographed fights, but despite that, the fight scenes are some of the most hype and exciting things you'll ever see. The reason for this is they play into everything that JoJo's is. Instead of focusing on fluidity and choreography to make their fights more interesting, they really focus on making each frame as interesting to stare at as possible. Crazy poses, unique backgrounds, and crazy shifts in colors all make the fights a ton of fun to look at. The show is constantly shifting colors to fit the mood, and it's become one of the most iconic parts of the series. In order to convey character traits, they would rather show it than tell it. The way they do this is by the way that people carry themselves, the way they color those characters, and really even the poses those characters hold. A great example of this is when Dio is introduced and instantly knees Jonathan's dog. It's like a personification of just a bad guy. Those mustache twirling evil for no other reason than to be evil villains from westerns. And they consistently drive this home in the things they do with him, as he just constantly looks evil. When Jojo and Dio finally meet at the castle at the end of part 1, the show does this again, and without any words needed, it conveys all of the feelings of the characters through one still shot of Jonathan and Dio. Jonathan looking like your classic hero standing in the face of evil, and I think that you could show this to pretty much anybody and they would be able to tell you which one is the hero and which is the villain without any context. All of these things are small stylistic choices that, despite JoJo's not having the most fluid or traditionally beautiful animation, makes it regarded to have great animation, because in a manga that doesn't have a whole lot of insane fights with tons of different moves, they work great with what they have and make each and every still frame as interesting as possible. Now, let's take a show like Steins Gate. Traditionally, this show doesn't have the greatest animation, but regardless of that, stylistic choices they make really go a long way. Oftentimes, the animation goes from bright to blurry to clear, replicating that feeling of a warm and hazy summer. They don't really show the outsides of buildings they're in, and instead all you see is blurry white light pouring in through the windows. Now this could have just been so they didn't need to animate outside the windows, as a lot of animes do this, but it just helps further that peaceful, soothing vibe that the setting gives, and it just ends up juxtaposing the plot perfectly. It's this intense and stressful psychological thriller, but all the stylistic choices give off this peaceful feeling that's almost like going inside to a nice and cool house after a day of playing sports or working in a hot summer. So although this show doesn't have the greatest animation and the action scenes are just plain out not good, it's still able to give this distinct feeling that it wouldn't have if those stylistic choices weren't there. And it comes off as a pretty memorable art style. And again, another great example of this on the opposite end is from a show that recently came out called Kamikatsu. This show went mega viral for having some of the worst animation we've ever seen, specifically when it comes to CG. But what this show does great is they play into that. The anime is a comedy and they use the bad animation to add to the jokes. I mean, they literally took a real video of a farmer and just edited an anime face onto this character, and it's hilarious. Not to mention this CGI monster that broke the internet with how horrible it looked, and on the surface you would never want to watch this, but when you actually go and watch the show, it doesn't feel immersion breaking, it feels like it's all part of the charm. So there's my next point. You don't necessarily need the most fluid and beautiful animation. If you can make do with what you have and make good stylistic choices, you can make your anime interesting. All these things just make these shows much more memorable. And I think the very worst thing that can happen with your animation is if it's just boring. Regardless of what you think of it, Seven Deadly Sins will always be remembered because of the fall off in animation, and you might be able to argue that that's better than just being a bland and forgettable show. If a show's going to be bad, it might as well just play into that. Pretty much any anime fan can spot a light novel adaptation from a mile away. That basic anime world, the muted colors, and just the overall safe animation. Think of all the basic isekai that have that same style. Pretty much most of the animation that looks like this, that doesn't have a super gripping and well thought out story, is just forgotten with time. And I genuinely think if a show like Mushoku Tensei had this bland animation, you really wouldn't be as willing to get into it, as it's a lot more of a slower paced show focused on character growth, rather than crazy action scenes and fights. Which brings us to another point. Don't make your animation boring. And now the final point I want to bring up is immersion. I think one of the biggest draws to anime for me, and I would say most other people, is that they can just do weird and insane things that live action cannot. But with that comes a level where you already have to suspend disbelief because you know it's not real, and with that it's a lot harder to connect to a series. And I think that's why one of the most underrated parts of animation is character acting. For those of you who don't know, character acting is all of the movements the characters do in order to make them seem more realistic. And it's something you don't really notice all that much until you do, and then it becomes one of the best parts about anime. The reason a lot of the Studio Ghibli films are able to captivate a non-anime audience is because of how realistically their characters move and interact with the world around them. This helps greatly with immersion, and the characters seem so much more real and alive, and it doesn't really feel like just a Saturday morning cartoon anymore. Chainsaw Man does this in a great way, as all the characters' movements, expressions, and reactions are all super realistic to the way a real person acts. Obviously it's exaggerated because it's an anime, but it immerses you, and in a show where the characters either make contract with devils or even are devils themselves, they just feel real, and it really helps you connect with the characters in a way that you couldn't if it just looked like basic isekai number 33. And that really makes the emotional weight of the scenes that come mean a lot more to you. Which brings me all the way back to my first question. Does animation matter? Yes. Is it the most important thing when it comes to making a captivating anime? No. Although good animation really can be that push to get someone to watch an anime, the whole anime doesn't ride off whether or not the animation is good. Can it be ruined by bad animation? Yes, it can. But I would much prefer interesting stylistic choices, like with the Flowers of Evil, rather than just forgettable animation. Good animation does not mean it's a good show. Bad animation does not mean it's a bad show. Good animation can make an otherwise boring or mediocre show a lot more fun to watch, but it can also be that thing that pushes a really good show into legendary status, and I think it's just important to take it case by case. To me, plot is more important than animation, but that won't be the case for everyone, and I think it's important to find what you enjoy and allow others to have their opinion as well, unless it's that Season 2 of Vinland Saga is boring. Anyway, that's all I got for you guys today. Thanks for watching. Peace out.